Help yourself to coffee and snacks and things. Good morning. He's done with it.
Oh. No problem.
I'm with everything.
Really good improvement on students' draft.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We've got a couple more weeks.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if you're going to do anything more with that Kootenai River before, I mean, like more field sites, because it's going to be hard to get more stuff in. So we have to figure out something like that.
Well, especially I was like, okay, you don't really want to pull on the results section. They do in the grant report, they just want like the conclusions. I tried to wrap as much of the results as I could. Yeah, they said that I didn't have very good quotes, and so I had tendencies, but I can send that draft to you.
Yeah. There are some juicy stuff in the written questionnaire part.
Yeah,
really juicy
the
stuff.
one, I'm gonna put it here, so I've got one
Yeah.
thinking about how that could tie or develop, you know, because like these are people who see Y2Y on my paper, you know, they're my mother, and some people who share that idea underscore the targets.
Oh, when you did your outreach, maybe you shouldn't do that every time.
Right, yeah. I thought about it, I thought about reading about it, I'm not trying to give myself a little bit of credit.
I read that it turns out it might not carry that much shade with people you really want to talk to.
Well, that's good. I think the ideal for me too is that I reach out to different business funds, and all that. I think it would be involved in the planning process. So that we
That'd be good to actually kind of.
Those are you.
So why did your title on your
Oh, it was so long.
You're inclusive. I really liked inclusive.
Maybe we should interview I'll change it right now.
You have to add that in the title, or it was in the title on graduation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. I just felt like it was about.
Change it for the presentation. We'll figure out maybe for the final.
Okay. Yeah.
It seems like a big part.
Yeah, I like that one. I think it.
All right, folks could get situated. You're not already situated. Crunching is allowed. Crunching okay?
Crunching's okay.
Okay, crunching's okay.
I can tolerate that.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I think I know all of you, but I'm Robin Saha, Rachel's academic advisor in environmental studies. Thank you for coming today and for Rachel's presentation. I'll say a few things about her and her work, and then introduce her, and she'll get started. The format will be for her to give how long is your presentation?
It'll be about that 45 minutes length.
We'll have
keep it in there.
About 10 or 15 minutes for some questions and answers, or answers or questions back at you, I don't know. Some discussion as well. And then afterwards, we'll ask you to take some last treats, and she'll meet with her committee. I want to thank Rosalind Lapierre for serving on Rachel's committee as well. Rachel came to us with a background in a Bachelor's of Science in Integrated Secondary Science Education and an Environmental Studies certificate from Ohio University in Athens, a fellow Ohioan. Her background is a lot in education, but also in facilitation. She has a lot of international experience that shaped her interest in multiculturalism and multicultural practice. She came into an interest in environmental justice in the program, and things have taken a little bit of a different direction, but her concern for inclusive practice, especially in collaboration and environmental affairs, has kind of been a consistent theme and thread of her work. She was awarded the Sargent Activism and Advocacy Award, just as a signal from the faculty of being a mover and shaker, and she certainly put herself out in various communities, doing her work in the program with an interest in collaboration and inclusive practice within natural resource management amid changing social and ecological conditions. So her portfolio, she'll tell you about it, but it explores collaboration and inclusion with a state natural resource management agency in Montana, inclusive practice with federal tribal programs in Alaska, and also does a stakeholder assessment with the same kind of lens of inclusivity regarding a rural county in Idaho dealing a lot with private land and conservation efforts. So it's a really nice portfolio, nice collection of work, and so let's welcome Rachel and thank her for
appreciate it, and I'm really excited to chat with you all here today. Most of you in this room have probably heard a bit about what I've been doing the last few years, so this is a moment of truth. So we're going to spend some time today to explore integrated natural resource management, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that means to me and how I'm defining that here. But we're going to look at some cases through my work in Alaska, Montana, and Idaho to achieve this understanding. So just a quick overview of where we're going to go today. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself as the student and researcher here today, and that'll give you kind of an idea of the lens that I'm viewing this through. And then we'll dive into each of the portfolio components. So my first one is a reflection on an internship I did in Southeast Alaska. You can see here with the X on the map. The second one is exploratory research that I did as part of Neva Hefflin's class here at the University of Montana at the DNRC. And then the final one is a stakeholder analysis just up the road in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, in Boundary County. So we'll talk about conclusion and reflection and what's next for me, and then some questions and answers like Robin already said. So just quickly, I wanted to talk about my background so that you guys can have an understanding of the worldview that I bring to this and some of my interests and ongoing pursuits through skills that I've developed in the past and that I'm ongoing into the future. So I grew up in Cleveland. I have an affinity to the water from the shores of Lake Erie from a young child. And then I went to school, like Robin said, at Ohio University, and I studied integrated secondary science education there. And I think that's important to note because it really influenced how I take an interdisciplinary approach even to this day, and trying to draw from a number of different approaches and kind of a more broad-based approach, as Kat said in her presentation, kind of this generalist mindset in a way, and like learning to embrace that. I also spent a number of years teaching in Colorado as part of Teach for America as well, which was really the beginning of me starting to consider social justice issues, which is why the environmental justice designation area came to be so of such interest to me here, and trying to kind of combine my passion with the land and connections with social justice. And as well, just my interest in people, working with people, having psychology and sociology is something that I really care about in my life. I've also had the opportunity to travel around the world, so I think that influences the way that I think about the world as well. I'm trying to be really inclusive and appreciative of different cultures and mindsets. I've also kind of gotten in the last decade or so back in touch with spirituality that really honors the cyclical nature and the interconnectivity between humans and the earth. And so when I put this all together, what it means for me is that I try to take a holistic approach. And so that's kind of the thread that I see connecting these three pieces as well in terms of my ongoing development and worldview. So interdisciplinarity is one that I spoke of, and then multiculturalism, so understanding how people interact when they're together from different cultures. And then social ecological systems theory is something that I got turned on to here at the University of Montana, specifically with human dimensions and natural resources class with Libby Metcalf. And so we talked a lot about adaptive management and resiliency and how linear thinking isn't adequate, and we need to really start to integrate the social and ecological divide rather than seeing it as a dualistic nature. And so that's kind of the way that I approach environmentalism these days. Okay, so any questions at all? So what is integrated natural resource management, or NRM? NRM generally is more or less what it sounds like, the management of water, soil, plants, land, resources that sustain us, and with consideration for impacts now and in the future. And integrated resource management is a definition that myself and Robin worked on to integrate that base foundation with the idea of not only interdisciplinarity between academic subjects, but also including communities and different government entities and levels in the process. And the reason I chose this term is because literature in the last 2 decades or so with resource management talks a lot about a whole breadth of topics. So community-based natural resource management, participatory, co-management, and they're all very nuanced and kind of apply in different ways to what you'll see today, and this seemed like a good all-encompassing term to use. Okay, so with that in mind, the 3 things I'll be speaking about today, again, first is the transborder boundary forest in southeast Alaska, reflecting on my time with the Student Conservation Association there, gender diverse leadership at the DNRC here in Montana, and stakeholder engagement in North Idaho, looking at constraints and values of various stakeholders there. All right, so here we go. A reflection on my time in Kikwan, which is the organized village of Cake in southern Alaska. So I'll orient you all here. You can see the Aleutian Islands, and then here's Vancouver Island, kind of halfway between here and there. A really beautiful temperate rainforest, the Tongass National Forest. But before it was Tongass National Forest, obviously, it was traditional territory of Tlingit and Haida people. And so now we have Kupreanof Island, which is actually a Russian term, which indicates their kind of history of colonialism there. So they are just on this island here. Kikwan actually means, and loosely translated into a town where the sun never sets. So partly that's because being in the north, you know, it doesn't for part of the year. But then, you know, being a community based a lot on the tides and fishing, I think they also they're awake at hours of the night that other people might not be. And if we take a look at the Forest Service map here, you can start to see that transboundary nature. So we have a number of the keys up in the right here, but so we have a lot of roadless area that's managed by Tongass National Park. This is a snapshot of their project management plan. And then Cake, way up top here, is gray, which means non-national forest land. It's actually owned by Cake Tribal and the Organized Village of Cake, which are federally recognized entities. And so you can see that same island has a number of different jurisdictions, and it's very rural. Most of this island isn't occupied for what I understand. The village is consolidated in the north there, and then there's a system of Forest Service roads that connect. Okay, so my daily tasks through this job brought me into really tactile work, which was pretty exciting to learn something new in that way, learning how to swing a Pulaski without breaking my back, and teaching some high school age students how to do that as well. So I was the crew leader, so essentially I was managing a crew of 5 youth that were local from the village of Cape, and each week we would have different Forest Service employees come out to work with us. So here we have our crew with 2 of the Forest Service gentlemen who work with the fisheries. So we brushed roads, we marked roads with signage to help people locate their themselves on the map, and we also, this was a really cool activity, marked the boundaries of an ancient dwelling site in the Kikuth Island. So we got to get on a boat, go across the sound, and take like soil sample tools, and you can find what they called shell middens in there, which is evidence of human habitat or habitation in the past. We removed invasive species, we surveyed for anadromous fish to see how far up they're getting, to find different barriers, natural or otherwise. don't feel like you have to read all this. This is just an example of, at the end, I also help the students update their resumes. A lot of the students I worked with, it's a geographically isolated island, so a lot of them have worked babysitting and things like that, odd job, but this was the first kind of 9-to-5 job a lot of the students had. So working with them to get them on that schedule and to help prepare them for potentially if they want to work for the Forest Service in the future or anything of that nature was something that was one of my goals. And we had a lot of other celebrations beyond just these daily tasks as well. So on top of our day-to-day activities, we also presented to the Organized Village of Cape Council. And this was a student's idea. We saw a lot of litter on the beaches as we were doing our work, and they were getting really frustrated by that. And so to mitigate the issue of litter around town, they wrote a letter to the executive director of OVK and then went on to present some plans for the future. And this up top, Anya Kastani, is a snapshot of one of the posters that we made, and that actually translates to Children of the Land. And one of the students we work with, she's incredible. She is so well connected with her culture and language. It's inspiring. And she brought this out at the presentation, and it really connected, especially with the elders. It was a very powerful experience. We also helped out with the 30th annual Kikwan Culture Camp, which is something that they are very proud of. They're well known in the entire Southeast region for conducting this camp. It was an honor for me to participate. I got to try a number of traditional foods that I never ever would have. Met some local elders. These are some cedar bark roses that they created at that event. Really special opportunity. And then we also helped with the fish derby with the U.S. Forest Service, which I will spare you all the details, but essentially they bring the communities together. And I think this is a cool opportunity to bridge kind of that historical distrust between the government agencies and really instill appreciation for them and just building trust back in between those two entities after a tough history. So what are some challenges that we came across? Well, first of all, just being in the wilderness brings about some challenges, so I thought I'd share this with you all. Yeah, right? So this was during our training in Anchorage, actually, but we saw so many moose in Cape and black bears on the roads all the time. It was wild. And so luckily we didn't have too many close encounters. Ah! Okay. Because it's not done playing. We didn't have too many close encounters, but I also like that clip there shows like a little bit of something precious that comes along with challenge, right? There's something to be an opportunity for growth there. So some feedback, or just let me back up. Generally, some challenges that I encountered was trying to serve as this kind of bridge between my youth that I was working with, or the youth that I was working with, and the Forest Service employees that were coming, and just the worldview differences there and the perceptions, and it was a struggle at times. And so I had some informal conversations, followed up with some formal surveys with both sides to see what was going on here. And so the staff from the Forest Service regarding working with youth was that they were lacking energy and motivation at times, and they had disinterested body language or a disrespectful tone of voice. The positives were that they were humorous, engaged with certain tasks, and knowledge-seeking. I chose to put this picture of us working with fisheries here because a number of the students were particularly connected with that, which makes sense. They know they're from a culture that relies on a lot of fish as the subsistence for subsistence. So that was a task that most of them are really engaged with. Others really more like native plants and things like that. But it was tough because not everyone liked the same topic. So you'd have one time when half the students are into it, and one time when half the crew's totally not into it. So on the flip side, the feedback from the youth regarding working with the Forest Service somewhat similar. So the obstacles there is when the irritation shows on their face, they have closed off body language and a condescending tone of voice, which came up in multiple instances, but not exclusively. There were a number of positive interactions as well. So the students felt most supported when the leaders were persistent, fun and engaging, asked questions about our life. That was a huge takeaway for me personally, just building that rapport and wanting to show genuine interest, having a positive attitude and being conversational. Which connects again back to that asking those questions, which I think is really important. And there's a quote that I wrote in my journal. I was keeping a journal during my whole time here that kind of highlights this a little bit. And I overheard an interaction between two of my students, and one of them said, "It seems like the Forest Service employees don't even like their jobs sometimes." And another replied, "Well, no, I think they just don't like us." And that was really, really hard for me to hear. And for a number of the Forest Service employees as well. Like I had these open discussions with them, and that was difficult. But so just, a recommendation I would have for the Forest Service moving forward is to have these conversations about how, we're the adults in this situation. We have to be the bigger people, if you will. And even if they are giving attitude or lacking motivation, like we need to persist through that and show engagement to get to know them and really show that we do care and we want to understand their lives and their worldview rather than just assuming that, oh, well, because you came to work late, that must mean that you are lazy, for example. It's more like maybe they were up at 4 a.m. fishing or, there's just these different worldviews that come into play. So I did a survey informally with my crew members, and I just gave them a quick 1 to 5, classic neutral, strongly agree or not, which I know is probably not the most specific, but get something out of them. And I asked them to reflect on their peers, on myself as the crew leader, and as the Forest Service employee. So overall, it's about neutral, pushing a little bit towards agree, and the question was, I felt respected by these people, so in that sense, agreement is positive. They were all neutral regarding each other, interestingly enough. They agreed, I felt good that they agreed that they felt respected by me. There's obviously probably some bias there, but then the Forest Service employees too, you can clearly see there are plenty of positive interactions and feelings of respect there. So I was glad to see nobody strongly disagreed with feeling respected. But here are some interesting quotes as well. Give you a moment just to kind of peruse through that. Oops, no. Oh, maybe not. There we go.
These are from the students?
These are from the students. Mm-hmm. And so some really stood out to me about having patience. This is something we explicitly worked on and circled back to time and time again about being patient. So it's something like they're very reflective. They're aware of their biases here or their drawbacks. Or, you need to realize work is work. It's not always going to be fun. This isn't, you're signed up for a summer camp. This is a job, which I think was driving a lot of the contention, as well as that the Forest Service employees, they're there to get their job done, and they need us to help them do that. So it's very productivity focused versus, well, again, not exclusively. I think the Forest Service employees who are most successful, rather than having that get this job done mindset, they were looking at it as an opportunity for professional development in a sense, so that they were like marketing the Forest Service in a way to these youth, so like as a potential opportunity for employment in the future, to help them generate their own skills, more so than like a cut and dry productivity driven mindset. Timber is a very serious job. Yes, it is, by the way. This is some work too. So based on all this, the reflections and recommendations that the students had, or I keep calling them students, they're really crew members, I wasn't their teacher, but to get more sleep, take care of yourself physically. We had a few injuries, not on the job, but in their free time, which hindered their work capabilities. Be gracious to others themselves. That one I could do that more myself too, so I like that one a lot. And show up to work. That's a good one too. So my top recommendations specifically to the Forest Service. I had a few, but some of them just logistically aren't feasible, so I tried to narrow it down a little bit. Boating and fisheries work with the local community, I think, would be very powerful. This is a Forest Service boat that we drove over to Cape, but there's plenty of boats in the village and people who are licensed to take folks out on those boats in that capacity. And there's work being done with local community members. There's a hatchery on the tribal side of the island. So I think that would be a really cool partnership to try and facilitate. Doing some overnight for bonding and team storming, forming, and norming would be really great, as well as employing a local crew leader. I mean, maybe there's not someone there that wants to do this job, but if there is, like, that's powerful. So that would be something I suggest, or a co-leader model, as well as I mentioned, cross-cultural communication training for staff members. I also would suggest putting this evaluation out sooner. I did this partway through the year, having students reflect on themselves and each other and myself as the crew leader regarding professionalism, attitude, work ethic, technical skills, communication skills. I also have a different schedule that might work a little bit better, especially Forest Service. A lot of times is based on 410s during the week. So following that model, if they genuinely want the students, or the youth, to keep with the Forest Service might be appropriate, but also making sure on the Monday and Friday you're really bolstering with opportunities and time for skills and training development, and then wrapping up in reflection at the end. So moving forward, I've been in communication with the manager for this program, who is phenomenal, so open-minded, progressive thinking, been in contact with OVK numerous times, like really spearheading this incredible person. And there's also some more partnerships that are developing around that. So I think I'm not going to be able to return this summer, unfortunately. It doesn't work with my timeline, but I am going to have the opportunity when I go to Anchorage in later this month to meet the CAKE leader who's going to be there this year and have an opportunity to share these results with her. Chish, thank you very much to everyone who made this possible. There's some NBA players, by the way, that came to visit on the ferry, and so we took a lunch break and they got all in regalia, and that was fun. So that's my time in CAKE, and I learned a lot from it. It was a challenge, and that's that on that one. I will pass this around, though. Some of you have already seen this, perhaps, but this is otter fur, and this was a gift from me, or to me, from one of the youth. It was a piece of regalia that she had outgrown, and I'm so honored to have that as something I can call my own. All right, any questions on that?
I was wondering if the Forest Service members were Native at all, and if most of the youth crew was Native.
Great question. All of the youth crew was Native. There was a number who were biracial. But so mostly there's a lot of like mixing between Tlingit and Haida. So that's their background, more or less. Not exclusively, but yeah, all of them had some connections to that tribe. And then the Forest Service employees that I know of were not.
Was wondering if the YCC or STA expected you to do these evaluations, or did you just take that on yourself? Because that's pretty valuable information. So, yeah.
Well, it was very interesting because the YCC program was so unique that even when I went to training for the general SCA stuff, a lot of times they'd say, you know, like, oh, this doesn't apply to you. So I'm kind of like, well, why am I in this training then? I could be like developing something else. And so that was one of my pieces of feedback to them, was that in some of their programs, they do evaluations, but this one wasn't set up in that same way. So hopefully they'll use my tools this time. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the DNRC and gender diverse leadership there. I got excited about this topic because I've been really curious about the idea of inclusive leadership in general and how positions of power, essentially, especially as connected to natural resource management. I mean, the land is arguably, in my mind, gives you the most power in this world is access to those resources. So management of that needs to reflect the constituents, especially if it's public land that we're talking about. So that includes women, that includes people of color, that includes everybody, the wide spectrum of values. So I wanted to see specifically with women how this is playing out at a state agency. So the Montana DNRC, just a quick background, was established during the Montana constitutional reorganization in the 70s. So they kind of pulled together some different pre-existing organizations. So they now operate under some different divisions. They have conservation and resource development, forestry, oil and gas, trust lands, and water. And these bureaus and whatnot are all managed pretty hierarchically. So you can see they've got the citizens of Montana being into public lands at the top, but that feeds into your Board of Commissioners, and you have division administrators, bureau chiefs, program managers. It's all pretty vertical, as you can see. So you have your governor is the big wig at the DNRC. You have your director, and the chief of staff is a woman at the moment. I didn't get a chance to talk with her, unfortunately, but that's cool, big deal. The forestry division, just after I completed my interviews, promoted the first woman, the first Montana state forester. Very cool as well. And I had it in my mind that I would maybe go through and try to figure out who all of these were women or not, but it's really difficult. There's not a lot of longitudinal data I could find on that, and it's really hard to make assumptions based on names and based on people identifying with different gender along the spectrum. So I didn't speculate on that. But the guiding questions I did adopt are along the themes of leadership approaches, workplace values, and gendered constraints. So what are the ways in which women are leading? What are the ways that they find supportive in terms of their supervisors, workplace values that are supportive of them? So basically figuring out how do women lead, what's supportive to them, and what has been making their experience difficult to navigate, if anything. So some definitions that are important to this work that some of you may be familiar with already. Implicit bias, this is stereotypes that play out subconsciously in the day-to-day interactions. And, we all have them. I myself am really, that's something I'm striving to be more self-aware of and not acting on these implicit biases because they can have real material implications for people. For example, benevolent sexism, as opposed to when you hear hostile sexism, sexual assault, harassment, these kind of blatant, overt, negative activities. Benevolent sexism is something that came up in my studies, actually, which we'll talk about, which is more discreet discrimination that can actually be like masked with good intentions, acclaiming women for beauty and kindness, for example. Those seem like very positive traits, but they can actually, it's been shown that it can limit their self-concept and therefore how they interact in the workplace and what they achieve. And another one I wanted to highlight is horizontal leadership. And this kind of I use to encompass a different array of leadership styles, but more or less it's like this inclusive approach, but not in terms of so I wanted to differentiate because when you're talking about inclusive leadership, as I brought up in terms of women being included on the leadership board, this type of leadership is more like actively participating and collaborating with people in your department and with people outside of your department, so that you have a wide reach and more of a collaborative vision. So my methodology for this was one-on-one interviews. I spoke with 7 women. I digitally recorded them. It was based on a phenomenological approach. So none of this is meant to be generalizable back to the population. This is just exploratory to find out what's going on and really generate more questions too. So I purposefully sampled self-identified women who have been at the agency for 5 years or more, who are in bureau chief or program manager or higher position. And then I transcribed and coded a process which any of us who are in Neva's class understands well, under different themes of workplace dynamics, leadership. I also asked them for some advice in the end too, but so this is just an example of some of the things that were coming up in my coding. I used Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word to do some comment functions there. So on to my findings. I reported those based on constraints to gender diverse leadership first. And it was a big takeaway for me that a lot of the women supported that although there are not a lot of women in the highest levels of leadership at DNRC, there are changes that are happening, and especially in the field positions and the kind of entry-level positions. So this individual said it's not that there are not qualified people to take these roles, it's just that they are not encouraged and nurtured from before, or they just want to get married and have children. And I wanted to highlight this quote for a couple of reasons, because I found that like encouraged and nurtured from the fore points to me that there's not a sort of mentorship program that's in place, and that's maybe the first thing that they could use this feedback as a recommendation to try and work that in somehow. And beyond even just at the DNRC though, I spoke with one woman who felt like this even extended into her prior experience. Even growing up, you know, it's like ingrained in us from a very young age. She worked on a ranch, and she was saying that her father always gave the rough and tough jobs to her brother, and she got to sweep the barn, you know. So thinking about how that plays out in the workplace in implicit ways. Also, they just want to get married and have children. It's also kind of, this was tough for me to think about where this is coming from, because in a sense, it represents implicit bias. Because it shows that even as a woman, we're kind of expecting that like you can either have children or you can be a leader, but don't really expect to be both. And I think that's problematic. And that was pointed out in a book I read by Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In, that women who choose to be in leadership and have children are judged for not being good enough mothers, not taking the time with their children. And then on converse, people that choose to stay home with their children get judged for not being in the workforce, you know, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. But it also represents an internal barrier, something that women place on themselves a lot. Because of those societal implications. Regarding implicit bias and benevolent sexism, I thought this quote really summarized implicit bias in a good way. So they're talking about that shift in values that is slow to go away. It's an inherited bias, is what she called it. So it's not something that you're consciously picking up. It's something that is brought through historical, social interactions. This one, I mean, I love dragons, so this stood out, but also because it's kind of, this says a lot. I had to really bend backwards for them to know that I'm really not a dragon lady. This quote really highlights the fact that a number of women across my survey felt that they were more harshly judged for being like aggressive leaders, but the men in leadership had similarly direct leadership styles in their opinion. And so they were expected to be more nice, or conciliatory is a word that got thrown out there. And so they had to be really careful about not being too submissive, but also not being deemed aggressive. And so that balance was a really challenge for a lot of the women in these roles. Finally, leadership approaches. Some folks were really across the board on this, so my conclusion is that it has a lot to do with what division you're in. They spoke about fire, for instance. They kind of justified this command and control type approach because it's an emergency response, versus, you know, other folks really wanted to have more consultative, collaborative, inclusive, participatory leadership. And so this quote kind of points to that autonomy that they desire, not only for themselves, but to give to their junior status employees as well. So I feel like everybody is pretty open to providing the opportunity for you to really shine and do your own thing. So that, they're kind of half and half between feeling like unilateral decision making was the agency's greatest barrier, or that they experienced autonomy. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly here, but again, someone said that the strongest barriers that they place are on ourselves. There's still a large subset of the population that have expectations about how we behave. And so therefore, it is not about having a preponderance of women in leadership that is going to make this change. It's about having people of both sexes, quote, in the agency who subscribe to a different set of norms and expectations. And I went ahead in my discussion, and I think I didn't go into this in too depth in my paper, but what's been on my mind a lot is like the emerging movement that gender is not binary, and there's a number of different, it's a spectrum. And so I think that this final quote about having people of all sexes, all genders, right, in the agency who are inclusive-minded is really what it comes down to. I heard some suggestions about interviewing men or other agencies or people of color, so we're just going to keep on going from here. So this quote by Justine Musk, I think, really summed that up well, that the enemy of patriarchy isn't men. Sorry, start over. The enemy of feminism isn't men, it's patriarchy, and patriarchy is not men, it's a system. And women can support the system of patriarchy just as men can support the fight for gender equality. That was really sums up my findings of this, which I felt was pretty powerful. All right, so in the sake of time, I'll have you hold any questions that you had on that one and dive into the stakeholder engagement in North Idaho, which was my most recent experience. And a little bit of background, this was through a grant that I received through Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. I wrote this proposal for a class, Ethics of Restoration with Pedro Marquez, in fall semester, and then I received a call in January that, hey, you got this, which was fantastic, but also like, I got to get this together and want to do it. So it's the Sarah Baker Memorial Fund Student Research Grant, and this piece is the report to that agency, or to that NGO for this work. So I centered in on the Kootenai River Valley, which starts in British Columbia, comes down through Montana, Idaho, and back into British Columbia. The history there is very heavily based in mining, agriculture, and timber interests. And it constitutes the Ktunaxa Traditional Territory, which is a nation that has been split up into a number of different tribes at this time. So the Kootenai tribe of Idaho is the one that fell into my parameters, which was in Bowser County, Idaho. But there's the Ktunaxa tribe in British Columbia, as well as the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe here in Montana as well, that have a lot of the same like historical connections. The Y2Y vision, I just wanted to highlight, it really connects to my overall understanding in terms of believing in the connection and not the separation between humans and nature. So connecting back to that social ecological systems thinking, that it's not this dualism between humans and nature, but it's about bringing these together in a holistic approach. And so when I was applying for this grant, I wanted to try and find something that would be useful for Y2Y themselves as well. So this is their Region 7, the Cabinet Purcell Mountain Corridor, and there's a linkage zone here, which, so you can see Libby, Missoula, Sandpoint, Boundary County is right up in here. So it connects the Cabinet and the Purcell Mountain ranges, and so bear species such as the grizzly bear and there's a number of other endangered, threatened, or proposed listed species in the area that use this as a connection zone. Especially given the riparian ecosystem, there's a certain draw there at certain times of year. Here's just a close-up of Bonners Ferry. I think it might be the only county that borders two states and another country, because it's like in the panhandle, and so it's only one side of it is even next to Idaho, the rest of Idaho, which is kind of interesting. But so for those of you who are familiar with Northwest Montana, you got your Kootenai National Forest, and so the river starts up, comes down through Rexford, and Libby Dam, it plays a big role in here, and you can kind of see the river starting to get braided and winded up here, but you can also see that there's a number of fields and agriculture. So through Montana, it's primarily public land that surrounds the Kootenai River Valley, but in North Idaho, it's primarily private land. So I was compelled to learn a little bit more about that. I'm gonna skip this.
It's okay if you know, we can go till, I don't know, 11 if we need to with questions and answers. So yeah, just
Okay.
take a few extra minutes if you want to.
Cool. Because this was really a fun project for me. It was in Rosalind's class, and I wasn't going to play the whole thing, just like 3 minutes to help give you guys like a picture of the area in North Idaho.
Nestled between what is now commonly known as the southern Selkirk and Purcell mountain ranges, the Kootenai tribe of Idaho sits amid the northernmost county of present-day Idaho.
They just use, like we call the Kootenai River, our highway. Everybody usually moves down the highway throughout the year for different things.
I had the honor of speaking with Angela Cooper of the Kootenai tribe of Idaho Tribal Council.
This is our land, but we all live here and we need to share it. All I've seen is everyone working together, and it's great that people seek out our help or they come to us for advice.
But it wasn't always that way.
They wanted us to leave, but my ancestors said, no, this is what we're going to stay. They had no resources. They were giving these allotments but had no way to cultivate the land or anything or bring themselves out of the poverty that they were in.
The whole Kootenai Valley, every year in the springtime, when the snow melts and all that kind of stuff, it just to flood, the whole valley used to flood. And it just to create many ecosystems.
Before all of the floodplain controls were put in place for agriculture, it's easy to imagine what this place could have been like. Where the river is wide, and there's many unique critters that are below the surface that are both ecologically and culturally relevant. Rhonda Vogel is the administrative director of KTOI and a passionate Bonners Ferry community member since 1973.
One of the tribal elders, Ron Abraham, when he takes his kids and grandkids out in the mountains, he reminds them, your ancestors stepped on this very ground at one point. What did they see? Or see what they saw?
So I'm here at the Libby Dam where Lake Kootenai becomes the Kootenai River once again. And there's a number of birds that I can hear. I see some ducks around where the outflow moderation occurs. It's a pretty standard natural soundscape. And yet there's this persistent underlying background hum, very clearly connected to the power that's being generated by this massive volume of water that I can see rippling from below.
So that was a fun new skill set to get to try. So thank you, Rosalind, for that opportunity. And I'll be sending that to Y2Y along with this and see what they do with it. But I also, the cool part about it is that was just some interviews with the tribe. And then on top of that, I have interviews with Fish and Game and a number of entities that I can maybe do a follow-up. So here's a picture of Libby Dam. This is creating a lot of changes in the area, which is partly why I was interested in this region. So here is where the Kootenai River emerges from the Libby Dam. And here's a picture of a hydrograph that demonstrates the changes in the pre-dam era and then the post-dam, and it shows when they've started to put some flood release flow mechanisms in place. But so you could see how the spring flow in May was much, much higher before Libby Dam. And then, I mean, it drops to, that's the whole point of the dam essentially, right? Is to moderate flood, mitigate flood, but then also to provide a constant rate of power throughout the year. So it makes sense in that regard, but you can see even after different legislation to try and incorporate alternative flow patterns into the mitigation plan for the white sturgeon, which I'll show you in a minute, we're not even approaching like half of what that peak flow volume was. So species like Accipenser transmontanus, or the Kootenai River white sturgeon, have been suffering because of this. This fish is so cool. I love it. It's prehistoric looking. I mean, it's just Oh, cute. They have a hatchery that is run by the tribe, which is phenomenal. They actually did some work with the burbot previously that was a listed species, and it's completely successful now. They've reopened the fishery entirely. There's no limit to the catch that you can have in that fish now. And so the sturgeon, unfortunately, hasn't achieved that success. They haven't had a successful recruitment event, a natural recruitment event. So that is like reproduction without the assistance of the hatchery since '74, which is when the Levy Dam was constructed. So ponder that. So you can see they used to be like pretty huge. I don't know how tall these individuals are, but the fish have been recorded at 12 feet in length or over 300 pounds. So not only could it be considered an ecological keystone species because of the niches that it fills, but I'd also consider it a culturally relevant keystone species as well. And a really cool example of that is the Kootenai sturgeon nose canoe, which they had a model of at the tribal headquarters. And so the canoe was actually built to mimic the shape of the sturgeon's nose to help with the water flow, or not, but like help with the canoe more efficiently through the water, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's why I was interested in this region in general. And now once I got there, what did I do? So I conducted some landowner surveys as well as some focus group interviews. I was really trying to get a mixed bag of approaches to try and identify or to like reach out in different ways to acquire different input and really get like a broad reach. And so I sent out 100 paper mail surveys, which Len, I remember one day came in like, "You're still stuffing envelopes? Are you serious?" So that was a whole skill set in itself here. But also I went to Boundary County and visited with a number of agencies there. But I'll back up a moment, and here is a copy of what I sent out with just a little like information about who I am and some examples of the region. And the survey itself is here. I actually have 2 copies, so I'll pass that around for you all to check out if you would like. So I was trying to address different values that are important in the region and what are constraints, like why are people participating in collaborative conservation or why aren't they? So that, I didn't say that yet, I guess is my focus is the collaborative conservation here. And there's a number of collaboratives in this region I found out as I've started digging deep and kind of enacting snowball sampling. Did I not put that on this one? Snowball sampling method. So I'd call a lot of people and then they'd refer me to the next person, and so lots of time on the phone. And then once I actually got there, I got a chance to speak with the Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative, which is a really productive collaborative there. Yeah. So I used parcel data to compile addresses in order to send these out. And then I entered the survey responses manually into a SurveyMonkey platform to help with the analysis. Here's a picture of the largest contiguous hot farm in the world, which is in Boundary County. And then the methods for focus group, this is where that is. So the snowball sampling was for this one, where I was just kind of putting my feelers out there to see who was most involved. So you got Idaho Fish and Game and the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, as well as the Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative, were the 3 that came up the most in this region. So Idaho Fish and Game and Kootenai Tribe of Idaho specifically work together a lot with the fisheries specifically, and they're trying to mitigate for the sturgeon, among other species. The caribou was one that was a little bit contentious recently. They actually just brought the last caribou from the United States up to Canada. But so a number of other ones: Idaho Forest Group, Idaho Conservation League, 90 Trails, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. These are a list of the ones that I ended up speaking with. There's a number of others that I wasn't able to didn't really hear back from, so that's the limitation there. But these folks provided some really diverse and consistent ideas here. So I used a transcription program for this one and used OneNote as opposed to my last project where I used Microsoft Word, which if you guys have any questions about that later, I'm happy to answer, but I really like that process. So survey results, who speaks out the most? This survey response really stood out to me because most of them are pretty positive, but they were also really vague. I think that's probably a limitation of having a written survey, was that folks weren't all writing a lot. And there was one who actually called me back and confessed that as a elderly individual, it was difficult for him to write. And so he preferred to talk on the phone, which was fantastic, but it's a consideration for myself in the future. But so this individual is saying that it's the wealthy, well-organized, often out-of-state groups who have the most power in the conservation in the area, such as Yukon or Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative and other environmental groups who know nothing about the forest health, animal health, and populations and what they need, but wish to force their idealistic views on local people, regardless of their impact. So this is like, whew, me, right? Because I think my underpinnings as an environmentalist, I agree with a lot of what these environmental groups are doing. I mean, I just told you that I really appreciate Y2Y individually. I'm coming like as a researcher with their logo on my survey, so I'm realizing that probably was a no-no. This person felt compelled, despite that, to still share their opinion, but other people might have seen that and just immediately trashed it. The survey that is. But anyway, I think when I put my own internal bias aside, this is really informative in that there's different forms of knowledge that occur in this area, and this person highlights for me the place-based knowledge that different individuals have, especially if it's, I don't want to speculate, but if someone who's involved in agriculture, for instance, they're going to have a different understanding of the ecosystem than a conservation group might, and I don't know, do we have someone who's wrong and right? I feel like the idea of collaboration is to, as expressed by individuals I spoke with, was to try to find a benefit for everybody. And so I hope this individual might join us at our meeting at the end of the season, and then I get to talk to them face to face and find what sort of impacts they'd like to see. Just really quickly, there was some survey values items on here as well, and overall, they were pushing towards openness to change and self-transcendence. They fell into the self-direction and universalism category of the Schwartz value system, which, according to some of their beliefs or their theories, is more associated with pro-environmental behavior. Being progressive and seeing things in a collective mindset, essentially. Yeah, okay, so some of the key takeaways for collaboration was that this is from Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative, that they're asking to be at the table. And I actually witnessed that when I went to their meeting. They literally, rather than just saying, we don't agree, or backing away from the table as some groups do because they don't want to, they don't have the capacity, or they don't agree with the other person, and so they just put that blockade up. They will say, almost kind of sternly, like, you're going to invite us to that meeting, right? And, that kind of gets you a spot at the table. And if you're willing to take that spot at the table and do so in a way that isn't barring progress, that is what seems to be most effective for the folks here in Boundary County. That being said, there's no magic bullet for collaborative conservation, was a key takeaway for me as well. And I really predicted that to be the case. Everything I've read so far really highlights how contextual collaboration is. But here in this community, with the given economic, political spectrum that's there, they've had success in different ways, including having an open mind and be teachable, which I think probably applies anywhere. So what's next for this? I'm going to follow up with phone calls to people who responded to my survey, because that was only 15 out of the 100, which is a bummer. But again, there was a number of limitations that people have encountered, and so I want to try and help them overcome those by calling them, and also by reaching out to the people who did respond to try and get them involved in this planning process, because some of them did indicate on the survey that they would like to be involved on a more ongoing basis, including in the planning process and as well as face-to-face communication. So this will warrant another visit to Idaho, North Idaho, and I'm excited for that. And I'm going to have a town hall forum, so invite the landowners, and hopefully we can, with their participation in planning this, get some snowball methods out there, and then I can share my responses with them as well as get some more direct feedback. Okay, so in conclusion, these experiences have shaped me in a number of ways. They've helped me draw on my previous experiences with facilitation, with group management, with designing, surveys and designing assessments, which is something I did as an educator quite a bit. They're different in nuanced ways, but it was something that I felt engaged with. And on top of that, just engaging with people from different backgrounds is something that I'm always really motivated by. So I was excited to kind of use those skills in a new way. So University of Montana helped to push me to improve my academic writing skills, which is huge. Not something my undergraduate really emphasized a whole lot. So that was good. And specifically when I came to this program, I wanted to get skills with grant writing, which I did, so that was exciting. And along with that grant, managing a budget was one of those kind of tasks that I found mundanely rewarding. Just continuing to develop my metacognition, which I think is important no matter where you end up in your professional world, and seeing how, it's not about one end point, but a continuing developing process, and trying to kind of honor the strength in that interdisciplinarity that frames my worldview, and not getting too bogged down by, all of the other opportunities that are out there, but really trying to ground myself in a way. And for me, it keeps coming back to this idea, again, of holistic approaches. And so not just to land management, but to health and well-being overall. So human health, land health, those are the same in my mind. Mental health, physical health, those are things that I keep coming back to and I'm fascinated by. So potentially this might set me on a course in the future to be more involved in psychology, and is kind of like an ecotherapy type of approach where, healing the land will heal communities. But also in trying to incorporate different knowledges and honor diverse opinions and mindsets. So for example, some of the scholars in my human dimensions field, the human dimensions class that I took, we're defining traditional ecological knowledge as something that accumulates through cultural practice and transmission over time, versus the Western science method that's very Newtonian, often based in government management. And I didn't mention this with the Kootenai piece, but they actually said that this holds the most weight of all, especially with the Idaho Fish and Game being one of the key players. But this brought to mind a quote by Eleanor Ostrom that I recalled from that same class, that isolated knowledge does not accumulate. So if you are not interacting with both of those realms, I think we're not going to be achieving the resilience that we possibly could. And I could talk a little bit more about how I've seen this play out, especially it connects to our book we read in Rosalind's class, but it's a rally I got to participate in Alaska. But for the sake of time, I'll leave that for the questions if people are interested. And with that, thank you so much for coming, and I'd love to hear from you now.
We're kind of running low on time, so let's just take maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, so great job. I am very interested in your leadership in the natural resource management field project. I was wondering, you kind of alluded to mentorship as being something that could help women in that field. So do you have any other recommendations on how we can support women against these structural against the patriarchy?
Well, definitely things that I've read have really asserted that women in leadership is going to help, but then also it needs to change from the social level as well. And so at that time, for me, that feels kind of immobilizing. They're like, well, how do we change society? I don't know. But specifically, the DNRC is maybe the angle I'll take to answer that, because my recommendations to them were to have more training specifically on benevolent types of sexism or just implicit bias. Because in my experience, at least, especially with, the Forest Service was another federal or public agency that I had experience with. And it seems like time and time again, that's the focus of your sexual, you're like training before you go into a job, right? Is sexual harassment in those really overt, blatant forms. But we don't talk about microaggressions, or at least I haven't. And so I think that would be really powerful to talk about like why benevolent sexism isn't okay. But also employing feedback mechanisms. Sounds like some of the women I talked with did that on their own, but it's not a DNRC framework. So I think that's the first step too, to try to really get some sort of like feedback for the women who are there at the moment, but also some longitudinal information as well about how things are changing or what's working and not. Yes.
Wonderful job, Rachel. I was wondering for the Y2Y group that you surveyed for, I was wondering what recommendations you'd give them to avoid being one of those large groups from out of the area that tries to take control.
That's a great question. Yeah. Because it's interesting, because even Y2Y, you know, I know it's a large landscape, like that's their mission, is large landscape connectivity, but they still work a lot in that area. Like in my perspective, they almost seem like a local group. So then I'm wondering, okay, clearly something's missing there. So what is that? That's a great question. More involvement in the community, getting your face out there, which I think Y2Y is, just to pick on them a little bit, is really trying to do. They've been involved specifically with Idaho Fish and Game and a lot of the agencies, but it seems like they're not really involved in the public. And that's where a lot of these types of mentalities are getting incubated. So getting out to the public would be my first recommendation. And also, again, it comes back to that willingness to listen. They were saying that they're really, I might say this word, litigious groups, those that are focused on litigation, are barriers to collaboration in a lot of times because they're driven by, you know, we must stop XY project. So they're not interested in collaboration. And a lot of them said there's a necessary niche for those types of groups. But in terms of like just looking at the collaboration, I think that was a barrier as well. So being open-minded and talking with landowners in the public, I guess, is my recommendation.
Interesting. I think the results are going to really essential for that.
Yeah, I hope so.
Other questions? All right, well,
Thank you all.
we'll sure the conversations will continue. All right, good job, Rachel. You guys have ideas about that too, that you can share.
Yeah, I know. I feel like there are a lot of good conversations to be had after this.
Finalize.
I feel like you know, it's going to